Hi everybody, it's 314 React here. Today we are looking at 3DMark 2006. Last week we looked at 3DMark 2005, which used DirectX 9C. This is now using DirectX 9 again with Shader Model 3, but this time it has a massive expansion on how much Shader Model 3 is used. Again, you can download it from the legacy benchmark section of the UL website, which there'll be a link in the description, which will give you the code to unlock the full version of the software, because the software is now so old that it shouldn't be used to benchmark modern hardware, so they now give them away for free, which is really cool. So I've downloaded the very latest version from here. I've unlocked the full product with the key, and just like last week, I've also got the white paper for 3DMark 2006. So we can look through some of the new elements and some of the new functionality that they've added in. So here we have the page on comparisons to previous versions. So we've got 3DMark 99 concentrated on fixed function, vertex, transform, and lighting. 3DMark 2000 added support for graphics hardware, support transform and lighting, and 3DMark 2001 increased the complexity of the fixed function game scenes to tens of thousands of polygons per frame, and also introduced shader technology. So that was the DirectX 8 era. Then 3DMark 2003 introduced the DirectX 9 era, which used shader model 1 and 2 with only one game test fully using shader model 2. And then 3DMark 2005 we move on to DirectX 9C all the way up to shader model 3, and it wasn't heavily using shader model 3 because there wasn't much difference between when you set it between shader model 2 and shader model 3. It was just kind of the non-functional benefits of shader model 3, such as additional memory that could be used and other such optimizations. Now 3DMark 2006 takes basically 3DMark 2005 and raises the bar. It extensively uses shader model 2 and 3 for all vertex and pixel processing, and there are now 2 graphics tests using almost all key SM3 features, and now we are introducing HDR rendering. So here we have a version comparison chart between 2005 and 2006. So 3DMark 2005 interestingly says shader model 2 here, but it says 3 up here. So I think what they mean by that is that it uses all the functionality of 2.0 but just kind of ports it to the profile of 3, which is why all the tests look basically identical between 2 and 3 shader models, whereas 3DMark 2006 says it uses 2 and 3. 3DMark 2005 also uses no HDR rendering, but it does have bloom, and when you put bloom through a non-HDR pipeline, it can become very bright and ridiculous because you're trying to activate that bloom within a standard dynamic range, whereas now 3DMark 2006 has a full HDR pipeline, which means the bloom should be still pretty heavy duty because it's the mid-2000s, but it should be a lot more toned down, and the overall game should look a lot more higher quality. There were smooth shadows in 2005. The smooth shadows are again in 2006, but there's higher sampling rates. There's 3 graphics tests in 2005, all shader model 2, and 4 in 3DMark 2006, which are 2 shader model 2 and 2 shader model 3. There's 2 CPU tests, software vertex shaders in 2005, and there's 2 complex AI and physics in 2006. There's no shader model 3 feature tests in 2005, but there are in 2006. A few extra tests, extra levels of detail, more complex materials, more shader complexity with more instructions, and there's also more sub-scores. This is where they split the scores out from shader model 2 to shader model 3, as well as a CPU score. There's more VRAM usage, doubling from 128 to 256, and there's a reintroduction of the playable game, which the last time we saw this was in 3DMark 2001, so that'll be fun to check out. And the target GPU is of course shader model 2, and the target GPU for this 2006 is shader model 3. We're also starting to move into the realm of dual and multi-core CPUs, as at this time the Core 2 Duo was out, and I believe the AMD FX range was out, which was dual core. So it's starting to move more into sort of utilizing more cores. Still pretty early days, so I don't know how much difference it'll make or how much it'll actually utilize separate cores. I may try and have a look at Task Manager while I'm running it to see how many cores it's using and how it scales up all the way to a modern Ryzen 7700X with a RTX 4090. So there's some version comparison screenshots here. You can just already see just immediately the jump in quality. Do remember vastly preferring 2006 2005 just because the leap in quality was very high, even though it was pretty much identical tests. The actual fidelity increased quite a lot. So we have a quick history of the shader models here. DirectX 8 brought shader model 1, which allowed for very short programs that could run to move away from fixed function, but they were still quite limited, although it did take some of the work off of the CPU, which is the sort of journey that was going on at the time to move graphics work off the CPU and onto the GPU to accelerate things forward. We saw huge advancements with shader model 2 and DirectX 9 and higher level shader language, and then you could compile shader model 2 to shader model Model 3 essentially and get some slight improvements out of it. They were quite compatible, so I believe you could just basically shunt Shader Model 2 into Shader Model 3 and run it without necessarily seeing much change. Again, that's why 2005, when you flicked between Shader Model 2 and 3, you don't see much difference. Now with 3D Mark 2006, it's actually using Shader Model 3 a lot more extensively. At the time, as they mentioned here, there was not much graphical hardware that was utilizing Shader Model 3, but now with more independent hardware vendors having more Shader Model 3 compliant hardware, things are about to change moving forward so that there'll be a lot more opportunity to use new features of Shader Model 3. Early versions of 3D Mark used the Max FX 3D engine, and then 3D Mark 2003 used a very lightweight DirectX wrapper as more work was transitioned to the API. For 3D Mark 2005, they moved to an all-new rendering engine, and then in 3D Mark 2006, they've updated that engine. Extensive use of Shader Model 3, 16-bit floating point textures and 16-bit floating point blending, and the main new key element of the engine is the support HDR. There's also a dynamic building of shaders for each material in a high-level shader language format. These shaders are then runtime compiled to best fit the installed hardware. There's also the ability to set which compilation profile to use, so there's quite a lot of options for testing. Now onto HDR. This is basically where you move the lighting calculations from integer-based, I believe, 0 to 255, all the way to floating point, where you can go to absolutely huge numbers. 16-bit floating point to allow massive calculations and really complicated lighting calculations, as the name implies, to have a much more higher range of lighting that can be applied. And what you can also do is apply the bloom point to much higher floating point numbers so that you can actually control when your bloom kicks in. So you can have a really bright spot, say from a torch on the floor that doesn't have that much bloom but is pretty much as bright as the monitor will go. But then you can have the sun in the sky with that same level of monitor brightness, but you can have a much higher level of bloom on it. Whereas within SDR, you'd probably have to limit yourself so that the sun and the torch would have probably very similar levels of bloom, or you'd have to move the bloom point around, and essentially it just makes games look a lot more realistic. And this is what was introduced in the mid 2000s, and it's now standard everywhere. But back then, because it was a brand new feature, they went really over the top with it, so games were full of bloom, full of HDR, and that's why games from that era have a really nice nostalgic look. I'll put a link in the description, of course, to this white paper, as well as a whole load of links on how HDR and bloom works, because it can be quite difficult to explain it, so I'll just put the links in the description if you want to learn more about it. We also have dynamic shadow rendering. 3D Mark 2006 uses a type of shadow map called cascaded shadow maps. The implementation is to achieve angle-independent quality on dynamic shadows for all objects on screen. And there's a whole bunch of low-level detail on that there. Again, I'm not going to dive too far into that. It's also hardware-accelerated shadow mapping, which you can also flick on and off within the benchmarks. There's also heterogeneous fog. So they're ray marching through a volume whose density is defined by a volume texture as well as a simple height-based function. Ray marching, yeah, so ray marching versus ray tracing. I imagine a slightly similar concept, but obviously nowhere near as advanced as the sort of ray tracing we see today. That's really interesting though. Ray marching is where you traverse a ray iteratively, dividing the ray's path into small segments and sampling a function at each step. Kind of see an example here, processing each step, forming a function, and then bringing back a color for that pixel. I think ray tracing is just more advanced. As it said here, ray marching does not have many benefits over ray tracing, which finds intersections without marching through the space. So it's similar in concept, but slightly different, and has some probably more optimal ways of doing certain things, like shadows and clouds here. There's also a paper here from 1989 called Hypertexture by Ken Perlin, and here we have the paper. I'm not going to go into this because it is incredibly complicated and way beyond me, but I will put a link to the description if you want to dive into this further to learn more. And we also have the subsurface scattering effect, which is somewhat of an approximation, it seems, because they're saying here that real subsurface scattering would require extremely heavy ray tracing computations, which of course was nowhere near possible back in those days and probably is still quite difficult to do now. Basic idea is to estimate the thickness through an object with the angle of incidence between the viewing ray and the surface normal. So it doesn't quite go into details of how they do it, but it is basically an estimation, and it does have quite decent effects. Again, when subsurface scattering was introduced in the games, that was another thing that looked really nice alongside the HDR pipeline and bloom, made skin look a lot more realistic, and you could get a lot more realistic looking material effects. And I imagine subsurface scattering is now just a part of the overall physically based rendering pipeline, and we're going to see improvements of that as we go forward, especially capturing human likeness with ray tracing going forward, because of course humans in video games can look very strange right now. Even UE5's meta-human model is still pretty strange looking. There's also some information on the new CPU test Red Valley here, which consists of a maze of canyons and 87 fast moving units. So the game has 3 types of load in the CPU test: game logic, physics, and pathfinding AI. The game logic, including the graphics engine operation, runs in a single main thread that also drives the other 2 tasks. The physics simulation runs in a single separate thread and is synced with the main thread at each physics step, and the pathfinding AI runs in a number of worker threads, and that number of threads is scaled with available processors. This again has a fixed frame rate of 2 FPS to make more equal CPU load for all systems, and the resolution is locked to 640 by 480. Now the pathfinding algorithm is used by D-Star Light, and the physics are being computed by the AGIA PhysX library. So I believe if you had an AGIA card, you'd be able to hardware accelerate this, although that would probably go against what a CPU test is. I'm not sure. Maybe this was PhysX library but running on the CPU, but this is notable because this is around about the time that AGIA Physics was around, before Nvidia purchased them. So it's interesting to see FutureMark taking that into account. I'm not sure if 3DMark had a proper physics test. They might have done in Vantage. We'll see next week when I do the 3DMark Vantage video. I've got the white paper printed out, so as we go through the tests, I can flick through that and talk a little bit about the tests as we go through them. So very similar to 3DMark 2005 last week, there was an error on installation, but it didn't seem to affect anything. I could just click OK and the rest of the installation would carry on just fine. I have noticed, however, that in order to get this to run where you can see the text properly, you do need to change the DPI settings to System Enhanced, but that can cause some issues with it running in full screen when in 4K. So what I'm going to do is have the high DPI settings for displaying certain things here in the video, but when I'm running the actual tests and the demo, these DPI settings will be off so that it displays properly full screen in 4K. But if you're running this yourself, that's just something to note. Because if you're running without that DPI scaling at a high resolution, you can end up with some of the text here being squished up and weird, which ironically it's not doing now, even though I've just turned the DPI settings to normal. But that's just a quirk of running such old software. There is also a thread on VOGONS about 3DMark 2006 included in the 3DMark 2005 to 2006 thread, but I haven't seen a lot about compatibility because, as I say, this is quite newer, so there's not too many patches and hacks you need to do to get this running on modern systems. There's just a couple of little quirks, but I will post this thread in the description anyway. Again, the very familiar GUI, same as 2003, same as 2005, with a background of a 7900 GT, which is the card that I had in 2006. So here we have the standard roster. We have the Shader Model 2 graphics tests, Return to Procyon, Firefly Forest. Now these two look better, even though they're Shader Model 2, the same as they were in 3DMark 2005, without even using Shader Model 3. So I imagine there's just other improvements and optimizations that were made there. You've got the CPU tests, Red Valley, and you've got the HDR Shader Model 3 graphics tests, which are Canyon Flight and Deep Freeze. And then of course you've got the feature tests, fill rate, single and multi-texturing, pixel shader, vertex shader simple, vertex shader complex, shader particles, shader model 3, Perlin noise, shader model 3, and the batch size test. So we're going to enable everything, and it takes approximately 13 minutes and 17 seconds to run them all. Have these settings here. Again, resolution, same stuff. We're going to set that to 4K. We're going to set the anti-aliasing again to the maximum, anisotropic filtering again to the maximum. We're going to have the shaded profiles on 3, force full precision, something we looked into last week. It forces full precision on the calculations, and then you've got software floating point filtering, controls whether the post-processing filtering is done in hardware, FP16 filtering, or in the shader with software FP filtering for the HDR and Shader Model 3 graphics tests. That's probably something I won't look at because pretty much know that it's just going to be like forcing software vertex shaders, and then it will just reduce the performance a little bit. Anyway, other than that, everything is set to high. Got these system settings here, which show off these system settings correctly. Got my right CPU, RAM, operating system, and the graphics card. Got the results system here, which can be submitted online or saved to an Excel file. We've got the image quality test. We can generate single frames of a test and run differences to compare how they look. We're probably going to do that. I'm going to do some flicking between shader models, some of these, just to see if there are any differences. And then you got, again, the filtering and AA, which is probably going to be very, very similar to 2005's. Graphs, another thing we looked at last week, but again, we need MS Excel to look at it, so we probably won't worry about that too much. But in the 3DMark 2005 white paper, we can see what those graphs look like. It shows frame rates, frame duration, polygon counts, stuff like that. So it's kind of very similar to what we can get now with frame timings and stuff like that, giving a bit more of a detailed view. And then of course there's the demo, which we we've already seen at the intro of the video, but I'll be doing a commentary on to round this video off. And then again, we see the return of the game, which we haven't seen since 2001. And let's dive in to running 3DMark and see how well an RTX 4090 does on 18-year-old benchmarking software. So here we are, return to Procyon, the upgraded edition. So we saw Procyon back in 3DMark 2003, and then we saw it again in 2005 with an expanded test and some extra detail. And now here we are again with further extra detail. You can see again, even though it's not running HDR, it looks just a lot better in terms of the lighting, shadowing, and it's still running shader model 2, but I think they've just vastly optimized and improved what they're doing with the shader model 2. So you can see there's bloom there. Some of the bloom is a little bit over the top, but generally all the coloring looks a lot better. And they're using a lot more shadows. You just see there's a lot more dynamic shadows actually. I think the previous one in 2005 only had directional lights on this outside bit, and in the corridor it had point lights that would make dynamic shadows. But now I think there's just dynamic shadows from every light. Just got the white paper here. So yeah, it's built using the updated engine, improved artwork, more shadow casting objects, more lights, and using the new shadow technique. And it's still only requiring to use shader model 2. And here we go to Firefly Forest. Yeah, I've just read there's lots more light sources providing shadow maps in Procyon. So yeah, it's much more advanced and looks a lot better. So yeah, Firefly Forest. Got real-time atmospheric light scattering and fog, dynamic masked light sources, animated high detail geometry, and dynamic soft shadows from 3 light sources. So the ground material is similar to the metals in the graphics test one, with added diffuse detail, normal, and normal detail maps. And the rock surfaces also have a specular map. Similar to what they did in 2005, as you'll remember, but this time with more light sources. And the way those 2 lights blend looks absolutely beautiful, especially with the little particles out at the end there. Oh, there we go. See, the CPU tests are supposed to be locked to 2 FPS, but they're running way above that. And they're just rendering ultra fast, which is hilarious. So that's how I imagined all the CPU tests should run the previous ones on modern hardware. But it's just absolutely flying through. Here we go, the new Canyon test. Evolution on the Canyon Flight from 2005, with vastly improved shaders. And the same monster that they had in 2003. Large outdoor scene with HDR rendering, smooth shadows, and complex shader model 3 shaders. So yeah, we are on to HDR shader model 3 now. And look at that, that looks absolutely beautiful. Subsurface scattering, atmospheric light scattering of fog, pixel shaded water with depth fog, dynamic soft shadows, heterogeneous fog, and HDR reflections. So of course, yeah, the reflections in the water can also be calculated using HDR as well, which means you get much more detail from the lighting. That looks a lot more realistic. The Canyon material has 3 color maps, 3 normal maps, and Lambertian diffuse shading. And the water is a further developed version of the water shader model in 3DMark 2005. You can tell it just looks way better, way better. As mentioned last week, the water effect in 3DMark 2005 kind of looked like the water from Halo, whereas this is much more advanced now. And now we're on to the deep freeze, which reminds me of the X-Files film, and is really good for HDR. You can just tell the lighting just looks so much more precise. Nice use of bloom on the snow there. So you got normal maps, color maps, blend fong shading model on the snow, light scattering. The sky uses a procedural atmospheric light scattering system. Wow. 1 single directional light source. And it's using CSM shadows. In this scene, floating point rendering is absolutely necessary due to the need for extra precision in the lower brightness range. The average HDR value is around 11.000, neither of which would be feasible without using floating point rendering. So you've got the really bright snow, but then also the darker areas as well, and that's where you need HDR to kick in. So we've got the fill rate tests here, fairly standard stuff that we've seen for a while. Single texturing and multi-texturing, pretty much nothing new from 3DMark 2005 there. But then next up we'll have the pixel shader test, which we'll be using again HDR and shader model 3. So this is going to be the rock face. Nice complex shader. Look-ups the large textures. And then we have the vertex shader test, simple one, which is basically identical to the one in 2005. And we have the complex vertex shader test, which is again very similar to the one in 2005. Looks very, very cool. Wow, that was quick. Wow. The shader particles test. So that runs a simple particle physics system using a pixel shader. It displays the results through vertex texture fetches. So that was all done on the GPU there, and that was incredibly fast. Perlin noise, shader model 3. So that was using a pixel shader with 48 texture lookups and 447 arithmetic instructions. Very cool. And of course we have the batch size tests, which run tests on how many batches are sent to the GPU, batches of data, 128 messages, 128 quads, and then it goes up with 832, 128, 512, 2048, and 32,768 triangles per batch. So it runs through all the batch sizes and shows how different the performance is. So we should see the frame rate go up as the batch sizes go up, because you're sending more data in one go to the GPU and letting it handle it, I believe. I imagine the balance there would be sending enough data to the GPU for it to crunch through, saving the CPU time on the API side of things, versus the delay you'd get. Yeah, there you go. We've gone up about 20 FPS there on that one. This is the kind of cool stuff where it's about optimization, and how you can change how you send data to the GPU to get different performance. All the FPSs probably hit a bit of a plateau there. Let's go up to about 130 now, reaching about 130. Depending what section it's at, the frame rate can change quite a lot, but I don't think it reached 130 on the previous one. Yeah, 110, 120. Interesting. It looks like this one might not even hit 130 frames. Yeah, it's not an exact science. Here we have 46,577 3D marks with a Shader Model 2 score of 18,320 and a Shader Model 3 HDR score of 19,609. So it's kind of hard to go through in real time and explain what's going on in all of those tests, but again, the white paper is linked in the description. We'll go over these in more detail. It's interesting to see how the Shader Model 3 tests with HDR look so good, obviously, because they're actually fully utilizing Shader Model 3, but also how even the Shader Model 2 demos look a lot better as well, because they're just utilizing Shader Model 2 a lot more. So next up is the image test, and what we're going to do is set it to 4K, full anti-aliasing, full anisotropic filtering again, and what we're going to do is forceful precision. We're going to do basically what we did last time, which is where we're going to run Procyon with Shader Model 2 and 3, Firefly Forest 2 and 3, and then we're going to do comparisons with iCat. I'm not going to worry too much about these intermediate ones like 2A and 2B and all this. We're just going to go from 2 to 3. So it's a very similar story to what we saw in 3DMark 2005, and that between Shader Model 2 and 3, obviously you've got Shader Model 2 on the left and 3 on the right. The difference is not huge, but there are some tiny little things here, like some slightly more accurate lighting here on the side of the boxes here. And up on this thing up here, there's some slight additional lighting on the side of that. Well, that's more shadowing that's been addition there. So that's kind of a reflection. And then that reflection is a lot more toned down and a lot more shaded. So I imagine it's something to do with Shader Model 3's higher precision, or the ability to add more higher precision with the additional amount of instructions, that just makes these slightly different lighting. It's not too much of a difference really, and again it just shows how far Shader Model 2 can be pushed. And then we flick over to Firefly Forest, Shader Model 2 on the left and 3 on the right. Again, just from a general scan, not much difference. Let's do some zooming in. Yeah, very, very similar, even on the sort of shadowed bit here. Very little difference. Very similar story to last week, where in the tests that will run shader model 2 and 3, there's very little difference. But the tests that are on shader model 3 exclusively have a huge leap in visual fidelity overall. And then next up we have the filtering and AA comparisons, which is essentially the same as what we saw in 2005, where you can rotate, move around, you can change certain settings with mipmap coloring, so you can see where the mipmap's kicking in. You've got the texture types, you've got the geometry types, you've got the magnification filter, minification filter, the level of mipmapping being used, and the level of anisotropic filtering. All that can be adjusted so you can see exactly what happens with texture filtering and mipmaps, and you can get a really good intuition of how these things work. We're not going to look into this too much more because it's essentially exactly the same as 3DMark 2005's texture filtering test suite. Now, of course, we go to the really interesting bit, not seen since 3DMark 2001, the interactive game. So let's crank it all up to max. You can flick between 2 and 3 shader models. Let's notch that all the way up. Oh, it's Red Valley. Oh, that's loud. Okay, I thought it was Return to Procyon, but it's not. It's Red Valley. Okay. So we are flying a little vehicle around. Yeah, it's in the CPU test. And again, you can't change the mouse to be inverted, which is very frustrating. Oh, look at that shadowing there. That looks really nice. This reminds me of Star Wars Battlefront a little bit. So again, you got some Fong shading on the little vehicle there. The nice sort of building up front. Cool lasers. Switch between 2 modes of the vehicle. There's a very basic score there. The FOV is low and the mouse is non-inverted. Of course, it's not really meant to be a fully playable game. It's just meant to give a bit more of a real-time benchmark of something more representative of the load of a game on a system rather than a synthetic test. You've got the old school DirectX 9 sort of smoke effects there where they clip with the geometry. I think that was fixed in DirectX 10. Yeah, let's get the old white paper out. So here we are in the white paper. It's got some explanations on the minigame. And yeah, it looks like users were asking for a minigame test since 2001. So they brought it back. And it's much more like a real game than the one in 2001. The scene is not rendered in HDR since the CPU tests were rendered with shader model 2 in mind. But it does use the new dynamic shadow implementation, which is why the shadows look really good there. Let's turn it around to get a bit more of a view on the shadow. Really, really nice. Using any of the shader model 2 profiles, the game will use CSM, but only with 4 rotated point samples to smooth the shadow edges. The shader model 3 profile uses CSM, but with the same 16 sample kernel that is randomly rotated for each pixel. So shader model 3 should actually look a little bit better with this in terms of the shadows. Yeah, there's a couple of details about the turret here. The recoil is much higher in the higher position, but the view is better. And when you flick to this second mode, I think the recoil is less, but the view is not as good. So that explains the right mouse button different modes there. And you can upload the game score once you've killed all the enemies to the online result browser. Fairly simple little game that gives a bit more of a realistic view on performance. And this feels so, again, so 2006, so Xbox 360 style feeling. It's incredible. This is shader model 3. So if we flick to 2 and see how different those shadows look. Here we are in shader model 2. Oh, wow. Yep. Look at the difference in the shadows there. Wow. That's a very basic shadow map. And you can see kind of the limits of the shadow map there. The limits of the resolution of the shadow map compared to the... Wow. Compared to the shadows on shader model 3 where they've really blended them and filtered them. So yeah, not much more to see there. Play this game for a bit more. Again, runs pretty perfectly smooth because this is ancient stuff. Can't shoot the birds like Metal Gear Solid. That is fascinating though. I wonder if I can get a like-for-like screenshot and compare it in iCat. I'm going to give that a go. Here we are with shader model 2 on the left and shader model 3 on the right. And the most like-for-like screenshot I could get. And yeah, look at the difference there. Very hard shadows. with Shader Model 2 and much better blended shadows. Even the shadow on the vehicle itself, you can see there's a much more softer shadow coming from that little antenna and a much more harder one there. That filtering is really incredible. Even the textures look a little bit better with Shader Model 3. So this is quite a good example of where you can really see a difference between 2 and 3 in the shader model. Just look how much it cleans up that shadowing, like really obvious shadow mapping and then much more natural. That's a really nice advancement. That's very cool. You just see the sampling points of the shadow map and then really nicely blended. That must have been very hard on the hardware back in the day, but man, that looks good. Absolutely beautiful. So we've looked at the benchmark itself. We've got some results out. We've looked at the image quality, the filtering, and the AA. We can't really look at the graphs. We've looked at some of the other general features of 3DMark and a bit of the white paper. And we've looked at the first game since 2001. And now we will check out the demo while I'm doing some commentary over it. So let's dive in. Let's max everything out. Let's run it. So we start off with Procyon again. Again, same opening as 3DMark 2005. Some nice sci-fi sort of ambience into some Quake 2 style action. This part is pretty similar to the actual benchmark, but you'll be able to see a little bit more of the story. That extra lighting and shadowing makes all the difference. And if you were to do this in full Shader Model 3 and have those really nice CSM shadows, oh yeah, it would look really good. Yeah, that enhanced lighting, extra dynamic shadows. You can see the extra dynamic shadows coming from the muzzle flash of the weapons, which really sells the scene a lot more. I'm hoping 3DMark Vantage actually does have some of the physics stuff in, because I'd love to see more particle stuff. Oh, look at those dynamic shadows there. That is so cool. On the previous version of 3DMark, it was only this corridor that had point lights that made dynamic shadows. Still very firmly in the Doom 3 sort of fear era. So yeah, all those dynamic shadows there looking incredible. Hardware is really ramping up. I think the Xbox 360 would have been out at this point, and the PS3 was just about to come out. Ooh, I love those particles. There we go, a little bit of a throwback to 3DMark 2000. Oh yeah, look at that shading on the cape. Those physics calculations on the cape. Oh. Oh, we've seen a bit more detail what's in that container than 2005. There we go, Firefly Forest 2. Bit more abstract, a bit more ambient. This has a bit more of the feeling of 3DMark 2000 to it, which I really, really like. It gives me a nice feeling. Oh, look at that. Normal mapping, bump mapping. Specular. Ooh. It kind of captures that 90s, early 2000s feel, that Beast Wars sort of feel of graphics, but with the mid-2000s DirectX 9 enhancement. LOD pop in there. Interesting. Look at those shadows though, that the coloured lighting and the shadows all blending in there. So nice. Nice little particles behind them all blending in. Oh, it's so good. It's kind of adorable. And here we go. The selling point for 3D Mark 2006. The one that's probably on all the screenshots. This is where we get to see how the HDR... Oh yeah, the HDR really balances the scene out. It was very overblown on 2005. Because obviously it's such a bright scene, it's very difficult to get that with a standard dynamic range. It's so nice, lens flare sort of stuff, really nice bloom. You can really see that bloom kicking in. I don't think that is actually lens flare, I think it is just very nice bloom as you convert those huge lighting ranges down to the range of the display monitor. Some weird LOD pop in again. Oh, look at that refraction shader. So I said 3D Mark 2000 has a lot of nostalgia for me, but so does this one now. And in fact, I'm getting more nostalgic for these the more I'm viewing them as we go forward. Look at that bloom from those birds. That's so cool. You can really fine-tune the bloom. Oh man, that looks great. What looks so much more realistic. And the monster has been revamped. There's some subsurface scattering and some more details on it and more color on it overall. Here we go, thumbnail. Oh, that's so cool. That is awesome. I think the demo actually goes a bit further on this one than 2005. Oh, that's so cool. Here we go. Wow, look at that. And the reflection in the water as well from the sun. Really bright. Doesn't have to be a dulled reflection. Oh, man. Hey, it's like the city from Alien Covenant. Ooh. Oh, this is amazing. This is really good. Wow. This is awesome. This might be my favoriteest 3D Mark since 2000. Just watching it now. Oh god, how good does that look? This reminds me of the opening of Tomb Raider 3 and the X-Files movie. Oh, and The Thing a little bit. Yep, definitely The Thing. This is awesome. Oh, that's so creepy. This is really good. Time of day change, showing off the dynamic shadowing. Nothing pre-baked there. Oh, wow. Oh, this is really good. I haven't seen it in a while. Oh, very nice. The future mark symbol. So I think this is supposed to be the credits. But for some reason the text isn't showing up if there is meant to be text, which is very strange because all the other ones the text shows up absolutely fine, no problem. So it could just be that they were using some different methodology for the text rendering this time and it's not compatible with the hardware or software that I'm using, which is quite funny if that's the case. Just looking at a video online and there's no text there either. Oh no, there is meant to be text there. I've just looked at an older video from 10 years ago and there is meant to be text there, and then a newer video and there isn't text there. So I think it's whatever they're using for the text rendering isn't compatible with the hardware here. I don't quite know how to fix that. I might have a look on VOGONS after this. But yeah, that is a really, really good benchmark. And yeah, 2000 was always my favorite, and then 2001 I wasn't so much favorite. 2003, even 2005. But this one is kind of back to that level of what 2000 was. That feeling and that kind of abstract, weird nature, and really cool music and stuff. So I think they've brought it back, and I've got a whole new appreciation for 3DMark 2006 now, because that was really good. I really enjoyed that, and I can't wait to see Vantage again. So glad I've gone on this journey. I'm gonna have to get 3DMark99 working at some point. So yeah, this is where the credits are going, so we're gonna leave it on for a little bit longer just to enjoy the music, and then I'm gonna have a little browse through VOGONS. See if we can get that text 3 show up. So I've just been looking through Google a bit and can't find really anything about the credits text being missing. So I don't know if anyone's noticed yet. Don't know what's causing that to go missing. It's going to be quite hard to debug because obviously you're going to have to change settings and then run through the whole demo to get to the end just to find out whether it's worked or not. And the demo is about 16 minutes long. I'm not going to look through it and try and fix it. Yeah, let me know if anyone knows why that may be, if there's a fix for it. And I'll keep an eye out on the threads on VOGONS to see if there's a fix, because I'd like to get that fully working. It's funny though, it's funny how all the credits work in all the really old ones, you know, all the way back to 2000, the credits work fine, then suddenly the credits don't work in one of the newer ones. So, that was 3DMark 2006. Gained a lot of new appreciation for it. I really have, just watching it again and making this video on it. I really enjoy it, and I hope when we look at Vantage next week, that's even better. Thanks for watching. Leave a like, leave a comment, let me know what you think. Thanks for watching. Hope everyone's staying safe. Please do like and subscribe, and I will see you in the next video.